Okay, so now that we have set up the Flask server, the next thing we want to see is how to actually use the Flask from Ignition, or how to call these functions that we have set up through different routes in our Flask application. Let's just go back for a moment to our PyCharm and to our Flask test.py script that we wrote the last time. So we have defined different routes for our Flask application. The first one is just an empty route, which calls the hello function, which will just return the hello world message. Then we have the test route, which will return the message. This is our second test function. And we have this route with some parameter 1, which we defined to show how we can use some parameters in a function that we can pass through the URL. There is also another route, which is a shutdown route, which serves us to shut down the Flask server once when we are finished working with it and we no longer need it. So here I wanted to show you that besides this file, I have also created one short bash script, which is basically just serving me to run my Flask test Flask application, this one, and to set the virtual environment for my Python interpreter that I want to use. If you remember, here we can check in the settings which Python interpreter we are using for our project. And so here is the address of the virtual environment that I am using. So I just copied that address and put it here and just activate this virtual environment. This way I am ensuring that my Flask test application will be running with the correct Python interpreter, which means that I will have all the correct packages that I need in my file. So here I just run the script within the virtual environment. Okay, so now let's head into Ignition Designer and see how we can actually connect our Ignition project to the Flask server and call the functions that we have defined under different routes. In Ignition, there are different ways that we can use to call the functions that we defined in our Flask applications. And I will show you one of those ways that is maybe the easiest one to start with, because it doesn't require any additional components in your overall system architecture. And it just relies on what we have in Ignition. So what we are going to use are the gateway event scripts, which we can find, for example, here. And there are different types of these event scripts, gateway event scripts, from which probably you have already used some. And for our Flask application, for communicating with our Flask server, we will use the message, the gateway message event scripts. Specifically, we can see that I have 3 of those gateway message handlers. I have the Flask start, which I will use to start my Flask server. I have the Flask stop message handler, which I will use to shut down or to stop my Flask server if I'm finished working with it. And I have the Flask message handler where I will just send my message, my route, and this way call a specific function from my Flask application. So let's start from the beginning, from the Flask start. So here I will basically just run my launch bash script, which I showed you just a moment ago. So I will run the launch bash script, which will then use my specified Python interpreter to run my a Flask application. This way, the server will be started and will be waiting for our messages that can call the different functions that we defined for different routes. The next thing is this Flask message, where I will call the specific functions through the different routes. So in this message handler, I have left an input parameter called payload, which I will use to define the URL end, or the ending of my URL, which I want to send to my Flask server. So for example, if I want to call, I don't know, the test function and get this response that this is our test function, then I will, in the Flask message handler, I will pass the payload test. So the complete URL will be my local host, the port is 5000 test, and I will call the function which is defined here under the test route. So once I define the URL base and the URL end, I can concatenate them to create my whole URL, just like this, and then call the systemnet http get method to pass this URL and get the response that this URL will bring me. As my functions are defined in such a way that they will return something, this string will be returned upon calling this method, and I want my message handler to return this string that I'm getting back from my http get method. So my message handler, when I pass it the payload, will execute the function that is defined under this route and will return the response that the function is giving me. This is, in this test case, it will be this return string. This is our second test function. So I can later use it in my Ignition project in the place where I'm calling this message handler. And the third message handler that I have is the Flask stop. It is basically the same one as the Flask, just the URL end is hard-coded to be the shutdown, so that when I call this message handler, I will just send the my local host, the port number, and the shutdown route, so the server will shut down. The Flask server will shut down. Okay, so I have these three message handlers defined, and we are yet left with the coding part in the, for example, here in the perspective view, where we want to use our gateway scripts. So here I have this Flask Python run pop-up view, which I can use to start the Flask server, stop the Flask server, or run the function on the defined Flask route. So we can go in the coding of the different buttons of this pop-up. So for example, for the start Flask, I have configured an event on-click script. So here I will call my Flask start message handler by using the system util send request method. I need to define the name of my project. It is called ICC 2021 because it was originally, this example was originally created for our 2021 ICC presentation. Then I have to set the name of my message handler, Flask start, and because it doesn't have any parameters, it doesn't have the payload, I don't need to set the payload. I have added a timeout of 120 seconds, just in case if the Flask server needs just some moments to start up, so that it will just wait for this time for the Flask server to start running. After I do that, I will just change the label and say that the Flask server is ready. I will disable the start button and enable the stop button and the run button for running the Flask scripts. So when I press the start Flask button, it will become disabled and these two will become enabled, and this label will change to Flask server started. So then let's see what we have in the stop Flask button. So also we have configured an event on click. So here I'm also using the same method to send the request in the same project, but this time I'm using the message handler called Flask stop. It also doesn't have any parameters because here we hard-coded the payload to be shut down. But this one will have a response, so I want to read this response, and when I get the response, to put it in the text property of my label on my pop-up view. So after that, I will disable the stop button and also disable the run button and enable the start Flask button so that I can again start my Flask server. Okay, and I have the run button where I also configure the same event on click. This one will take parameters from the text field given here. So here in this text box we can add the route that we want and then press the run button, and the script behind the run button will take the text from the text box and call the send request method with our project name and the message handler name, which is in this case just Flask. And for the payload, we send the parameters, the Flask parameters that we just read from the text box, to our Flask parameters parameter. This request will also have a response, so we want to read this response and we want to display this response in our in the text of our label, the red one here. Okay, so if we just want to preview this pop-up, we can start it here. We can start the Flask and we can run our function with no Flask root. And if you remember, without a Flask root, we will just get the hello world message that we defined. So we can also add here the test and run. So here we get, this is our second test function, the one we defined under the route test. And we have another one called parameters, and here we can pass some parameter, let's say hello, and we run it and we get a response that our parameter is hello. Or we can send some number and we'll get that our parameter is 1, 2, 3. In this pop-up we can also stop our Flask server, and we get the message that the Flask server is stopped. We can again start it, run it, stop it, and so on. So in this video, we showed how we can set up our ignition project in order to be able to call the different functions through our Flask application by the different routes that are defined in our Flask application, and also how to get responses from these functions and display them to our user. Of course, these routes we can use as we did in this simple example to just get some message, but we can also use them to call some more complex functions such as a machine learning training function or a prediction function, which we will define in our Flask application. And this way we will be able to call this function and get the response in ignition.